Or not robot.
So exciting.
Just start.
So exciting.
No, but you were working on school stuff, so it's approved.
Oh, actually, but I just moved. It's 3 o'clock. We need to meet with our team member to work on it further. Is it okay for
At
like
3
for
o'clock?
half an hour? It's 3 o'clock.
Well,
And then we'll get back.
my thing lasts until 3:30, so it's an hour and a half.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah, and then it's done.
So that
And
is
then
good.
Lilia will come in and do something, and then.
Oh,
So it's not the rest of the day.
Where should we sit?
Wherever you want.
Then I'll take this.
please.
Well, yeah, but also.
No. Oh, you
I like this setting as well because it's more interactive.
Is there a lot of things that we're gonna write down?
Yeah.
Well, you don't have to write down anything because you won't get the sheets. And the most, the actual theory I have also as a paper.
Okay, so no note taking.
No, so I'm going to, well, if you want to, obviously, but I'm going to try and explain some things and I'm going to work here a little bit. And there's also interactive bits here and there. So that's how it is. So, hi, welcome. I'm Marco. And I think we met during that introduction. Everybody brings something, pop-up dinner type situation. So I am I'm the coordinator of the scientific leisure studies program that we have here. But I've also been a lecturer and coach for the Imagineering Master for years and years. And this year I'm coaching Femke and Kiki, so two of the executive students. And my background is in philosophy of psychology and ethics and that kind of stuff. So from that perspective, I'm also going to explore a few things with you, and you're going to do some things and give me input as well. On the field of philosophy of Imagineering, so basically the conceptual foundations of what Imagineering social innovation is, a little bit of ethics towards that. So that's going to be today. However, first things first, we do have a guest today, an international guest. And please, maybe introduce yourself to the kids.
To the kids.
Yeah.
Hi. My name is Thiago, and first of all, I want you to guess where I'm from.
Brazil.
Ah, come on, you know.
You already knew.
You knew it.
Thiago, the name.
Where are you from?
Could have been Portuguese or
Where are you
not.
from?
Peru.
Because she's amazing.
Are you
She watches a lot
sorry.
of Brazilian soap operas. Yeah, I know it.
But, okay,
There are a
so,
lot of Brazilian people, so.
So,
and
Yeah,
Brazil and Peru, are you like mortal enemies, or is that
not at all.
not?
More and more friends, I would say.
Yeah,
Getting
friends.
closer and closer.
Of course, as it should be.
So, yes, I'm from Brazil and I'm here for this week. I have some collaboration agenda with Celiani, maybe you know, and other colleagues. We just met Marco yesterday and we were discussing potential collaboration at the level of masters between Brazil and
Potentially interesting opportunities also.
nice and exciting, inspiring collaborations. I'm from the University of São Paulo, which is the biggest in the country, actually the biggest in Latin America, I would say. Almost 100,000 students.
It's just a tiny bit more than Preda University. They have about 7,000.
And this is a university funded by the state of São Paulo, where I come from. So this is a public university. And I have my background in tourism studies, but in my faculty I teach for undergrad students in leisure and tourism studies, one career, so no separated careers in our case. And that's why we've been discussing potential collaborations with BUAS, because we do have these connections with these different topics that are really important for us. And if you are interested in knowing a little bit more about the university, what we do there, we have a master in tourism, if you're interested. We're very open for these sort of combinations. You can, if you want, go there for 1 semester or 2 months. And hopefully our students can come to here as well. And I'm here just to learn a little bit more about philosophy of Imagineering.
Well,
With Marco.
I'm not sure you came to the right place, but I'm going to give it a try.
Yes, yes.
And
Yes, I think that's it.
yeah, so the connection, obviously Imagineering is not necessarily about leisure or tourism, but there's a very strong connection. And there was also a reason why the Master of Imagineering is embedded in the Academy for Leisure. Namely in leisure, but also tourism. There's a lot of power to change society and to infuse society and societal problems and communities with a positive force, right? And that's also what Imagineering is about, getting stuff done and making the lives of people better. So that's where some of the connections could be. So we've been discussing a potential research project about the role of leisure in communities and how that benefits quality of life, well-being, and those kinds of things. But we can expand that. There's lots of ideas to make something interesting happen between Breda and South.
Do you have your backgrounds in tourism or leisure? Or
Yes.
Very diverse. I
Very
think.
diverse.
Yes.
okay.
People come from all over.
Uh-huh.
And also, you're the regular students, right?
Yes.
You also have executive students who are already working in a company. So that it's even more diverse than that.
They just come for 1 day.
In the week,
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a very long day. So on Tuesday I met my 2 kids at 8:30, and they were here until 7.
Yeah.
So,
This exceptionally.
yeah.
Is there any executive student here or just
No,
regular?
only on Tuesday.
They're listening.
It's not the day. It's not the day. Ah, I see. Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
Executive
Hi.
students.
Big brother is listening. So be careful what you tell us, because everything is recorded.
Can I rephrase everything I said before?
No, I think it's part of the permanent
Recorded,
record now. I'm sorry. No,
It's
oops.
live.
Yeah. So when you get back home, then oops,
I guess
what
I
you
didn't
told
say
that
any-
time in Breda.
Yes.
Everybody will know about.
Yes.
You know, often, exception for her from Peru, all of you are from the Netherlands.
No.
No.
So no means
70.
Yeah, it's a roll call.
Russia.
Russia.
Lebanon. Holland. America.
Netherlands.
China, Russia, and Germany.
Russian, German,
Indonesia.
Indonesia.
And Peru.
Where,
See, it's super.
where are you from in Indonesia? Just out of curiosity. Where in Indonesia?
Bogor. It's near in Jakarta. Very near.
Bogor. Also. I've been there.
Oh.
In Georgia, also.
Georgia?
Georgia.
Ah, that's my favorite city.
Really?
Yeah.
Is that recommended to go to? I will be in Indonesia in 2 weeks. No, 3 weeks.
You should go there because of Borobudur and
Borobudur.
and Prambanan.
I'm supposed to be working there.
Observation.
Observation,
No
yes.
participant or participant.
Participant research.
Good job.
Observing
Research.
culture.
You see, they learned everything.
They're already very tricky. Yeah. Anyway, we also have, this to do. So, philosophy of Imagineering. So, I have a very ambitious plan for the coming 75, 80 minutes. So let's see how far we get. And this is it. So, basically what I want to do is to dig a little bit deeper into what Imagineering is, what it does, and why it is capable of doing what it does. Because maybe also giving a definition of what Imagineering is a bit tricky. We'll get to that. Yeah, as we already established, the group is quite diverse in terms of cultural or national background, but I think also in terms of content, in terms of domains or disciplines where you come from, and also in terms of, as I've learned over the years, in terms of interest, in terms of either theoretical or practical interest. So I've marked the different chapters with a little construction site that's interactive stuff. A little book is a little bit of theory, but some of them are only 2 slides, so don't worry. There's a lot of YouTube videos in that one. And towards the end, that's a little guide dog. There's a little ethical guide in terms of this is what you should ideally do as an Imagineer. So that's going to be what we're going to be doing today. So digging a little bit deeper into Imagineering, what it is, what it does, and why it is capable of doing what it does. But first, just to get things started, a little example and also a question to you guys. So these 2 guys, Veno and Veno, in an article in 1992, they described a case about the Australian Motorcycle Grand Prix. So it was a big event, several days with motorcycles racing and all kinds of other side events. And that event was organized every year. But year after year, they noticed that security and keeping things quiet and under control was a bigger and bigger problem. Because as you might, well, maybe it's a little bit of a prejudice, but maybe it's also a little bit true. Motorcycle riders, cyclists, some of them are a nice, upstanding citizen, but some of them are also maybe not, you know, Hell's Angels type people. And there was a little bit of an issue with that group, so, you know, very rowdy and drinking and yeah, making all kinds of problems. So the organization of that event had a problem. How can we get this under control? Now they did find a solution, and that's of course going to be the next slide, but just as a starting point, a little thinking exercise. If you were the organizer of this event and you had the security issue of this group of people making problems, what would you do? What kinds of options do you have in your magical Imagineering toolbox?
Find out why.
Find out why?
Why they have, why they're rebellious or aggressive.
Uh-huh.
What's actually happening in the first place.
Right?
Do we went Luther? More flowers.
More flowers.
Yes, you know this experiment about trash on the streets,
Yeah.
where on the streets where was graffiti,
Yeah. Uh-huh.
there were a lot of trash,
Yeah.
and when they cleaned it,
Uh-huh.
people already feel that
Sure.
it's already clean. That's why they didn't put trash on the
Okay.
streets. So I would do it more more pink.
It's actually, well, I'm not sure that flowers would work at a motorcycle show, but the idea is not as odd as it sounds. Anyone else?
Well, I like the idea, like, if you look at security, they often are very authoritative, and rebellious people don't really deal with authority that well. So if you dress the security people, well, not with flowers, but maybe a little bit more civilized, or maybe secret agents.
Secret agents.
Yeah.
Spies. Oh yeah.
Undercover.
And if someone starts acting up, then they can just.
No, well, you can just you can.
A flower. Here's a flower.
You can look at the
So there's this 200 kilo bearded guy standing with leather.
Just
Oh, here's a flower.
Just can you imagine? He's going too aggressive. He's drunk, and now instead of fine, instead of aggressive against him, you give him a flower.
And
You just start talking with them.
And would flowers work, or would you need something else?
It might be then enough to throw them off guard, so they're so startled they change their mindset. It
Yeah,
takes
but
them from an
they're still
aggressive.
drunk then, maybe.
Yeah, it could be enough to, you know, startle them out of their anger. Or,
Disrupting the system.
yeah.
Maybe
Very
music.
good. I'm sorry.
Music.
All right.
Voice
Just
music.
happy music,
Yeah.
happy hardcore.
Yeah. Maybe the festival itself like something they want to do. Because maybe they act up because they like some more free environment to do. So they could very separate event from them.
Take the food away.
Yeah. We used to have this.
No alcohol.
It's a long explanation. I'll
Oh.
just skip it.
Oh,
But it's
if it's a good explanation,
yeah.
don't skip
Can I
it.
give it? Because there's
How long is long? Is it like half an hour?
No, it's okay. In where they had very rebellious places in war zones, where they had really big demonstrations and stuff, they always found that people start demonstrating after their work because they still need to earn money. And they started keep going until really, really late at night. So when they did some research and found out that if they would take all the food carts away, people after work they start demonstrating, but you know there's nothing to eat. They get
Hungry.
hungry, they go home.
All right.
So that's how they solve this demonstration. You take away the thing that's kind of catalyzing their anger and kind of helping them in creating this and going further, and let's solve it.
Okay, so interesting ideas, but I think a combination of flowers and giving them something to do is in fact also what they tried. And it's, oh, sorry.
I wanted to say maybe involve them.
Exactly. That's exactly it. Because at first they tried the top-down repression angle, right? So if there's a security problem, get more security agents in there. So the spies that we heard about, you know, more police and more things, but that also only increased the tension. But at some point someone stood up, someone maybe with an Imagineering heart, not with the Imagineering diploma because obviously that wasn't around back then, but at least with some of the ideas that you guys also have. And they said, instead of repression, instead of giving them fewer options, give them more options to participate, to co-create side events, to maybe display their bikes and everything. And what you do then is you make them stakeholders in the process, and you give them something to be proud of. If they have their own bike there and they're all buffed up and all the chrome looking nice and sparkly, then you're not going to create problems, because then you're also going to create problems for your own little thing there. Your bike is going to get damaged. So instead of repression, top-down repression, sort of bottom-up co-creation, taking them seriously, and then basically stimulate them to intrinsically generate well, I call it a morality structure, so a sense of this is the right behavior and this is unacceptable behavior. Because they are part of the thing, and because they have a stake in having that event being successful, they think, okay, maybe I need to behave in line with that responsibility that I now have.
Give them more ownership.
Yeah.
Exactly. So, co-creation, participation, positive stimulation, and then bottom up you get that self-organization process of, oh, but this is a better way of carrying myself or behaving in this situation. And that, I think, is the core process of some of the stuff that you've been learning about. So also, last Tuesday I saw my two, the executive students that I'm supervising, and I asked them, okay, what is it that the group needs? What is it that I can talk about so that you guys are helped most efficiently? And they suggested that you've been hearing about self-organizing systems and complexity and all this stuff, but what is it really about? How does that work in real life? Yeah, give us some examples of situations where that actually occurs. Well, that's what I'm going to be doing. This is a tiny little taste, just to start out. So, some of the, yeah, that's why I said, okay, maybe flowers is not the thing, but the thought behind the flowers is exactly what would work in this situation. So that's how.
You just said that we need to our Imagineering to show that.
No, but also interestingly, you started with the flowers, and then someone else says, okay, take food cards away, and then maybe a side event, and then you give them, and then collectively, you know, co-creatively, you arrived at a similar solution. Not necessarily saying that that is the only solution, but together you complemented each other, and then you got that. So that's also how the entire thing works, right? So, that's what we're going to be looking at. So what is this? What is this process? How does it work? What's behind it? Now, a tiny little bit of historical context. 2 slides. This is one of the book chapters, or one of the book sections, the theoretical sections. Because there is a reason why the Imagineering approach, co-creation, participation and things, fits with the current time frame. And it has to do with what society, at least in Europe, but I think increasingly in other parts of the world, is like. How did we get there? So after the Middle Ages, the Enlightenment started. So Middle Ages was very religiously defined, right? And the Enlightenment, starting in the 17th and 18th century, was basically, it started the reign of natural science and of technology. And with that development, also started the Industrial Revolution, the steam engine, all that stuff. But with that development also came a kind of, well, maybe you can call it superiority complex of the scientists and the technicians and the engineers. Of, well, we have things pretty well figured out. We know how the universe works, or almost. And we can build trains and all kinds of other machines, so we can basically reshape the Earth in our fashion. And that sort of generated the idea that man was the master of the universe. So we know everything, we have all this power, all this knowledge, so a great sense of security, right? However, parallel to this, but culminating in the 20th century, also started a different development, and that was the development towards postmodernity. So this sense of security, this idea of we know pretty much everything that there is to know, we know how the universe works, started getting cut down step by step by different theoreticians, different scientists. Already started, by the way, in the 15th century with Copernicus, who said, sure, maybe you could argue that human beings are very important, but we're not the center of the universe. So we're not at the center of everything, at the center of creation. You know, we're not at the center of everything that God made. No, we're to the side somewhere. The Earth is not the center of the universe. What we circumvent the sun, right? So we're just one of many different planets. We're not that important. A similar step, but you know, even more so, was made by Darwin, who basically said, with his theory of evolution, we are not the best thing to ever come out of creation. We're not the best thing that God ever made. No, instead, we evolved, just like all the other species, all the other animals and plants and all the other organisms. We're just one of many of those evolved organisms. We're not the best thing to ever happen to the planet. No, we're not that special. Friedrich Nietzsche also cut down the religious idea. So instead of supporting the idea that we have God to watch over us, this supernatural force, he said, well, God doesn't exist. God is dead, he even said. And we did it. By the development of science, we didn't need God anymore to explain things in society. So, we're not at the center of the universe. We're not the best thing to come out of God's creation. We don't even have this supernatural force watching over us, taking care of us. We're on our own, we need to take care of ourselves. Then came Marx, Karl Marx, and he came with this theory that eventually Marxism eventually resulted in communism, right? But the underlying idea of his writings, especially Das Kapital, which he wrote together with Friedrich Engels, was that it basically sort of a democratic idea. So the people should hold control of the means of production, and they should be able to have a say in what happens. In opposition to the old idea where the elite, a very small elite of rich people, decided everything that was going to happen. Instead he said, we don't even have that elite anymore, or we shouldn't have that elite to make our decisions for us, we should make our own decisions. So, we're not the center of the universe, we're not the best thing to come out of creation, God is not here to take care of us, the elite should not take care of us, we need to do it ourselves. And then came Freud, Sigmund Freud, you know, one of the first psychologists, and basically he says, we're not even the master of our own thoughts. You know, you think you're making your own decisions, but in fact there is a very big subconscious part to our mind where our passions reside and all kinds of things are already decided before we ourselves become conscious of it. So we're not the master of the universe, we're not at the center of the universe, we're not the best thing to ever happen in creation, God doesn't take care of us, the elite doesn't take care of us, and we're not even in charge of our own behavior. So that what's left over? Uncertainty. We don't know. Who are we? Where are we? What should we do? And that's basically the underlying idea of postmodernity, that nothing is certain. There is no single explanation for anything. Instead, there are many kinds of explanations or suggestions coming from many different directions. So part of this development was also coincided with decolonization, right? So the idea that instead, in the old time, the Western European narrative would be dominant, and now we have voices from many different corners of the world, different ideas, different voices, different opinions, also wanting to become prominent and say, okay, we're also here. We also want something to say. So that's basically the underlying idea of postmodernity. So there's no single unifying truth. Very little is certain, but instead we have many different ideas, many different perspectives, many different viewpoints. Now, what kind of a society does that result in? So, I think it was a year or two ago, I was on in the train station near my house in Rotterdam, and I saw this this poster. It's for We, that's a Dutch clothing store. Not very hip, but they try to use this rapper called Typhoon to promote their stuff. And there was this this little piece of text which tries to sort of instill in the person watching this poster, okay, you matter, you're important, your feelings, your emotions, your experiences, those are important, and that's the foundation for you to, well, basically engage in this capitalist rat race and buy stuff at We. So it's a very ironic message in a sense. But there was some stuff in there that was highly, highly postmodern. One of them is the centrality of experience. So it's not about facts, it's not about structures, but it's about what you experience, what you feel, your emotions, and how, what you're experiencing all day long. And of course, that's a very important focal point also in marketing and advertisement, right? So that's a very dominant thing. Even if you watch the nightly news, NOS Journaal, for instance, or RTL News or whatever, and something happens somewhere and they connect to someone, a reporter on the scene, usually either the second or sometimes even the first question is not what happened, but how did you feel about that? What were your impressions? What were your feelings? How did it come across to you? Apparently that's very important. So it's about relating to emotions, but it's also very individualistic. It's about you as a person. It's not about us, but it's about you, so egocentric also, almost. And performativity, in the sense of expressing who you are, expressing what you want, and doing all those things. So Instagram culture, basically. Look at me, look how interesting my life is. So in that sense, and of course marketing, yeah, not always, but tends to have the pulse on the society. So marketeers know very well how they can push people's buttons, right? So this is a very postmodern marketing message. Focuses on the experience, on the emotions, on the egocentric nature of the modern consumer, and tries to make that the most important thing. So that might sound like a bit of a depressing message, you know, individuality and all that stuff. However, there's also potential there, potential for us as Imagineers, especially when it comes to the centrality of experience. Because what is it that you do as an Imagineer? You use that stuff. You use this kind of a personality profile and look for leverage. And one of the points of leverage is using experiences. So, we're already at stage 3, see? We're doing so Imagineering operates within that postmodern context and also works because of the properties of postmodern systems. But then of course the question is, what is Imagineering? And that's a question that I'm posing to you. Can you give a definition? Well, fluff, fluff, fluff.
We just did an exercise.
Good. What came out of it?
Because we did the exercise.
Yeah, so what came out of the exercise? What was the exercise was, give the definition of Imagineering?
It was like you write something on Imagineering and people start to add up to it.
Oh yeah, sure. Okay.
So, creating positive change with collaborative solution that tackles people's needs and raise new perspective,
Right.
co-creation, revolution, shifting paradigms.
Right. Okay, yeah, sure, I hear a lot of good things, but I also hear a lot of things that could be just any kind of change management. So what is it about Imagineering that sets it apart?
Innovations.
Innovation?
Something new,
Yeah.
what you create by yourself, with a new way when you are looking at something.
Okay, and how do we generate those innovations?
Through transformation.
Yeah, innovation, transformation, they are very close together, right, those concepts?
Collaboratively.
Collaborative,
Yeah.
that's an important one. Yeah.
It's not that something you find a solution for. It needs to align with all the complexities and everything that is happening at this context,
Yeah.
at this moment, and to ignite a new approach, a new solution.
Ignite. Okay, so that's one of the terms of the, in the engine you need to write an ignite type of thing, right? So ignite is an important term. But ignite, that's an interesting one. So how do you ignite? And what is it that you ignite as an engineer? That's two questions. Oh, hi.
Maybe I want to, what ignite and the imagineering, what I think is actually imagineering is a design for evolution, but how to do that is by igniting a person by give them ownership to things.
Yeah. Also a little bit in line with the earlier example, right? So igniting, evolution, ownership. And what tools does an Imagineer have in his or her toolbox to do this? How do you ignite this, whatever it is, this evolution?
Through co-creation, artificial solution,
Creative tension engine.
Yeah.
We set the physical environment, we move a little the comfort of the people
Yeah,
to
yeah,
make
yeah.
them think different.
Yeah. So reframing, for instance. Yeah. Okay, so I hear a lot of good things. I have some suggestions of my own, just to add to yours, and then maybe we'll get to some coherent idea. So, Imagineering is a form of social innovation, right? So it's about mobilizing people to move. And mobilizing people, ideally, to move based on intrinsic principles, so it's not you as an Imagineer saying, okay, this is what you need to do, this is the plan, go there. But it's about getting the people in a system, in a company or whatever, to start reorganizing themselves towards a better place. Whatever that better place is decided by the system, by the people in the system themselves. Right? So, yeah, as a slogan you could say Imagineering is designing for business innovation or transformation or social transformation from a narrative perspective. And that has to do in part with where Imagineering came from, and also with the reason why Imagineering is embedded in the Academy for Leisure. Because it came from the creative industries, you know, art, design, architecture, fashion, those kinds of things. So people making things, making new things, and usually involving not only materials, you know, tangible things, but also people. And using these things also to get people to see things in a different way. So I like kind of like the example of fashion, because maybe, you know, when you look at it superficially, you think, okay, the fashion is they make new outfits every year. But those things that you see walking down the runway, you know, all those outfits are not really the outfits that you get in the stores. Those outfits are there to basically open up people's minds to new possibilities, to new trends, to new colors, to new styles. And then derived from that, other designers start making the stuff that you can buy in the clothing stores. So those designs by the couturiers are not what people will be wearing, but basically, well, maybe creative tension engines, sort of, or at least catalysts for change. Look at these possibilities, look at what it does to your own imagination, and take it from there. So that's what has been happening for decades and decades in the creative industries, in those creative domains, right? And the underlying idea also there is that, of course you can tell people what they need to do, but then they will forget it tomorrow because they've only been told what to do, it's not really their idea. A much more robust transformation if people get the impression that that idea for change or where to go came from themselves. So if you can stimulate people to figure out themselves, collectively, co-creatively, where they want to go, that's a much more lasting change, because then actually they take ownership of what happens. That, igniting that particular process, that's what the Imagineer has in his or her toolbox. That's the power of the Imagineer. Now how can you do that? So if you go back here, in the postmodern context, experience, having experiences is a very important component. People are looking for experiences, looking for excitement, looking for new stuff to experience. People intrinsically desire those experiences. if people want something of their own volition, then that's also something that you can use, right? So using those experiences to get stuff done, experience that people already are looking for, that's a big opportunity for the Imagineer. So, what? Oh, yeah. So the focus on experience of the postmodern condition is a very important opportunity for the Imagineer. Now I have a little definition of Imagineering, and that is that Imagineering is co-creation of shared values by designing or stimulating a meaningful or transformative experience. You will get these slides afterwards, right? So, not saying that this is the truth, but this is just my interpretation. And there's a couple of things in there, right? So one of them is shared values. So of course people already have values. They already have preferences, and they say, okay, this is the kind of person that I am. I want to be a good person, I want to be caring, I want to take care of my environment, I want to whatever. So that's already something that's there. And what happens in a co-creation process is that the different values from people from different perspectives get aligned, and one of those values, or a set of those values, becomes, together as a group, we're going to work towards the improvement of whatever it is that we're doing together, of our group dynamic. An Imagineer is also a designer, not of the solution, but of the process. Or sometimes not even of the process, but of the igniting, whatever it is that ignites, little buttons that you push to get the system to do stuff on its own. That's what you design. So you design interventions, or you design the context, or you design different aspects of what helps this system to transform. Now, one of the things that you can design is a meaningful experience. You can give these people in a system something that makes them think, oh, that's interesting, I hadn't thought of it that way, but now that you help me see this, I'm getting all kinds of new ideas all of a sudden. I'm getting inspired. Co-creation, mentioned a couple of times, very, very important, because you cannot do it alone. So Imagineering is very much a social process of people coming together from whatever corner of the world or whatever discipline or interest they come from, and doing stuff together, and together becoming aligned in improving the process. And then stimulation, of course, is what you do as an Imagineer. Now, okay, so there's a lot of stuff to unpack there, and we're going to try and make that happen. Social innovation Imagineering is basically about stimulating those bottom-up processes, right? Getting the people in a company, in a business, whatever, to figure stuff out on their own, rather than you telling them this is the outcome, this is the solution. Do that. So there are a few benefits. If it works, then it works really well, and all kinds of stuff that you did not expect can start happening. You might get really creative or innovative solutions that you yourself as an Imagineer also did not think about, but the system, the people in the system, start coming up with those ideas themselves. And that can be a very exciting phase in your project. You also get empowerment. People, maybe if you have a very unhealthy business environment, there's a lot of need for something new to happen. People feel underappreciated and powerless and whatever, and the manager is a jackass and whatever else is going on there. But if people get the idea, okay, I can contribute to a better solution, I am important to this process, that's empowering. They can think, okay, I do matter. I am important to this process. So here you also get co-ownership, so also what we saw in the motorcycle example, right? So you're not just someone carrying out an assignment, but you're part of the solution. And that's better. And then of course you can distribute the tasks, everybody contributes. There's also a threat, and that is that you introduce social and experiential and emotional components into a business process. And everything that is positive about that, or also everything that is risky about that. Because people might be emotional or have different opinions, or might not agree, or might not like each other, and that also gets introduced into that process. There's a bit of an issue there, but towards the end, if we make it to the end, is I have the 6 commandments of ethical engineering. That sort of takes care of that. The 6, yeah, I couldn't get to 10, so I stopped at 6. Right. Anyway, so I think self-organizing systems, I think you've already had lectures about this, right? Sort of complexity. That's not the same thing, but it's very, very closely aligned.
We had an example about.
So you had the flocks of birds and the schools of
Yeah.
fish,
And
etc.
yeah,
Suppos?
Retail
they're very
platform.
self-organized.
Oh,
They
okay.
use
Something very different, yes.
holacracy,
Okay.
which is very focused on self.
So, what we're dealing with in that, complexity thinking is complex adaptive systems, also called dynamical systems. It's a concept that came from physics. Already Isaac Newton, in the 1700s, was coming up with the mathematics to figure out this stuff. I also, years and years ago, wrote a paper about the application of this kind of stuff in psychology. But this is where we're looking at it in sort of a business and social system type situation, right? So, just to refresh your memory, no, that's for later. So this is an example of a complex adaptive system, right? So you get a school of fish, and then a predator comes in, disrupts the system, but then the system reorganizes. A school of a flock of birds, school of fish. There you go. So these are models of predators like seals or birds coming into a school of fish or a flock of birds. The system gets disrupted, gets thrown apart, but then it reorganizes because that's the most stable and safest form. So that's the dynamic, the core dynamic that you need to keep in mind. Okay, but that's a very abstract example. How does that work in real life? Well, there's lots of cool examples for that. And here is one that describes that process in a very understandable way, namely using eggs. So the logic of life. Hopefully the audio works. Oh yeah. Well, not very well, but we can hear something.
4 decades ago, on a long-haul flight, the economist Thomas Sally was breathing with a pen and paper and thinking about the problem of racial segregation. When he got home, he picked up a textbook and subtitles investigations. He was doing the same thing, simply lay out alternating black and white counters, or brown and white eggs, remove any tension, and add 5.
Let's try that. But then
4 decades ago.
Okay, this is better. Okay, obviously he's trying to sell a book. Did everybody follow along? Right? So the take-home message here is that you can distinguish between the components of the system and the system as a whole. They have different properties. So the individual components of the system, so the individual eggs, are not particularly racist. They just like to feel at home with, you know, people that are sort of like them. But then at the system level, you see completely different behavior, namely separation between brown eggs and white eggs. So that's a very interesting dynamic, and that's also reflected in how complex systems or dynamical systems work. So it is not the case that there is any one component of that system saying, okay, this is where we as a system need to go. Individuals behave individually, but the system as a whole, co-creatively, moves in a particular direction. That is a property of that system itself rather than of the individuals in the system. So, if we translate that to a more everyday example, namely a family. So suppose you have a family, so 2 parents, a couple of kids, and one of the parents gets in an awful car accident and gets injured, is now in a wheelchair. That is a disruption of that system. Things will need to change. You know, so working as he or she did in the past is not really possible anymore, or at least not similar to how it was. Also taking care of the kids needs to change. So the system needs to reorganize itself, reshape itself to act, to behave in a different way. So of course the system, the family as a whole, has as a goal, we want to be happy, we want to make this family work, we want to lead a good life. And then this disruption of the system comes in, and then it needs to reorganize itself to figure out what is going on and how they can get back on track towards a higher quality of life. But in a different way, with different actions, different behavior. Now that disruption can happen just, you know, of chance, but disruption can also occur with intent. So an Imagineer can also disrupt a system as it is in a company and basically force the system to reshape itself in a hopefully better way. So that is the dynamic that you might need to keep in the back of your mind. So there's several different things that you could do. One of the things, people can also do sort of self-therapy, right? Through leisure, for instance. So one of the interesting examples there is, at least to me, is wheelchair rugby, also sometimes titled murder ball. And that's basically, it's rugby but in wheelchairs, and those wheelchairs are also dressed up in metal plates, and they're bumping and crashing into each other. And oof. It's a very physical thing, very intense also. And what it does, it turns on its head the idea that if you're in a wheelchair, you're somehow sad or to be pitied or whatever. It's a very physical sport. It's very empowering also, so it also includes female players. And they're basically sort of negating the idea that if you're in a wheelchair and you cannot walk, that you're somehow less valid. You know, invalid, or that's the word already says that you're not valid. Well, they're saying, nah, we're not having that. We're going to do rugby. We need some, you know, sort of tank-like things, but we're going to do that. So what happens there is that people can use that special context of leisure, the experiences that are offered in leisure, to basically reframe their own existence. So reframe it from the initial situation, oh, I'm in a wheelchair, I can't do anything, to, okay, but look at all the other stuff that I can do. I can play rugby. I need some stuff to make that happen, but I can be just as active and just as physical as anyone else. So that's where people can take charge of their own lives. And yeah, the initial disruption was, of course, that they ended up in a wheelchair. That's the thing that they didn't have from birth on. But the second disruption is that people start thinking, hey, maybe we should start a murder ball league and do things differently. So that's that process, and getting people to take charge of their own well-being, and getting people to look for these kinds of opportunities. That's an interesting thing. Okay, so how can you do that? Also in situations where things are a little bit more fragile. Now I have it's a very nice little fragment, but with the audio being the way it is, you will get the slides, you can watch it at home. But it's a fragment from the movie Patch Adams, starring Robin Williams, who also sadly took his own life a couple of years ago. And it is a movie describing the life of the actual real-life Patch Adams, who worked at a hospital and thought, okay, so how things are being done at this hospital, that's not ideal. We're basically treating the patients like biological machines. And you need to put pills in there or put them in surgery, and then that's how you fix them, right? So a very sort of, very conservative view of what medicine is supposed to be. So the video fragment is only like 40 seconds long. A group of doctors walk up to this patient lying on a gurney, so one of these rolling beds, and they start talking. She's right there, but they start talking about her leg and about something that's going on there. It might be gangrene, and maybe you should try amputation. And then a woman is there. What's going on? And then from the back of that group, you hear, what's her name? And then that's him. And then you see the group opening up. So I was just wondering what the patient's name is. It's not a machine. It's a person who is very afraid about what might happen. If you start talking about amputation right then and there, medically that might be the right thing to think about, because you don't want it spreading, and then we're even further up shit creek, as they say. But it is a person with fears and with feelings and emotions, and addressing someone at that level is also extremely important. And that's a paradigm shift, right? And it can occur in addition to, of course, all the medical stuff. So Bates and Roberts, 2006, wrote a short paper about that, and there they appeal to that kind of viewpoint. They say, of course, there are the medical specialists. They need to know about pills and medicines and surgery and all those things. But you should also address people as human beings. What's more, even you make them co-creators of the patient experience. You should invest in them as people who are experts from their own perspective, namely they know what hurts, they know what they like and don't like. And if they don't, they can be helped to figure that out, right? So basically what they were saying was that you need to invest in the customer journey of patients. So not just from a medical perspective, but also from an experience perspective. So make it the best experience that's possible under the conditions when they are in that hospital. And another very interesting thing that they mentioned was that sickness, so being sick, unfolds in stories. So if you ask non-medically trained people that who patients usually are, they won't be able to give you the correct medical terms or whatever, but they will tell a story. I tried to get out of bed this morning, but something hurt and I couldn't, and I needed to go to my daughter, but I won't be able to, and I had this appointment tomorrow, and they start telling a story. So those experiences and those feelings and those emotions get shared in the context of a narrative structure of a story. So there's two sides to this. Sharing experiences can occur in a story, but also if you want to change those experiences, maybe you need to do something with that storyline. Maybe you want to change the storyline to get them to experience different things. So that's the underlying mechanism here. Change the storyline of being in a hospital, make it much more positive, make them co-creators of the patient experience. So that underlying dynamic is very important, very interesting. So stories and storytelling. Because if you put a lot of experiences in a row, you get a story. And why do stories have the impact that they have? Because they contain protagonists, they contain characters, people that you can relate to. People who have feelings, who have fears, who have desires, who have dreams and aspirations. And you as a reader or as a watcher of movies or whatever, you can relate to that, you can empathize. You think, okay, this person is afraid. Yeah, I would also be afraid in that situation where Freddy Krueger is coming at him with the claws and everything. So a story has the impact that it has because we can identify with whomever it is that is doing things in that story. And that's a very powerful potential, a connection that's almost naturally and automatically there. And that's a very interesting thing, and you can use that as an Imagineer. And I can explain to you how. Because if you can change that, if those experiences and how people feel are organized in that storyline, that story structure, if you can change that storyline, maybe you can also change or enhance their experiences. So a concrete example of that occurs at the Breda Redhead Days. Do we have any redheads in the room? Sort of reddish thing in your beard, maybe? No. So this was an event, I think it's now moved to Tilburg, but it was organized in Breda for years on end. Gatherings of red-headed people from all over the world coming together in Breda for a couple of days of activities, of parties, of events and things. Now what is interesting about that, red-headed people are rare. There are not many of them around. So yeah, we've all been in elementary school, right? And you know that it can be a tough environment. So if you are different than the rest, then you sometimes get picked on and you might not have a very good time. So that kind of an experience is an experience that all red-headed people share. So they have that shared storyline of being different, of standing out. But not at this event. At this event, they're together with people who share that particular trait in common. And instead of something, a trait that that gets people to pick on them, during this event, that being red-headed is something to celebrate. An entire event is organized around being a redhead. So that event, that positively charged reframing of being a redhead, gives them new energy and new possibilities to form social bonds, to connect to people. Also really lifelong friendships get generated during these things. So that's during an event experience, that feature of being red-headed get reframed, get flipped around from something that's maybe not very positive to something that is something positive. So the experience and the togetherness and the co-creation during the event flips it around. So that's an interesting power that you then have. And you can design for this, because there was an event organizer, right? So there are people who organized this get-together. And, well, you could maybe call that person an Imagineer, because he or she organized something, a context within which these people got to reframe their red-headedness. Okay, so you can do that in events, you can do that in stories, you can also do that in images. So here's a very powerful one, that it's possible even in stories or also images to transmit feelings, emotions that might be very different, very alien to us. This is a self-portrait by William Utermohlen, and he was at some point diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. And he kept making self-portraits as his sickness progressed. And you see his own self-image changing. Now I'm going to flip through some of them. As far as I know, I don't have Alzheimer's. But seeing that sort of at least transmits some of that meaning, some of that charge, right? Maybe you're also familiar with how songs can be very powerful in transmitting a particular emotion. Here's something similar. So this is self-portrait from '67. In 1995 he was diagnosed, so in '96 he made this self-portrait. Another one in '96. 96. 97. 97. 98. 99. And 2000. You see him fading away. It's very powerful, at least I thought it was. So there's lots of things that you can use as an Imagineer to transmit a very powerful message and to instill or ignite in people a very powerful response, a very powerful experience. And that can be used, that can be a tool. How does that work? Well, the underlying mechanism has to do with metaphors. Now who knows what, there's a definition there, but who knows what a metaphor is?
It's
give another meaning. Yes. So it's basically also a transformational tool. So you describe something in terms of properties or images or whatever of a different category to imply a transformation of meaning. So when you say a mountain of paperwork is not to be taken literally, it's not really an actual mountain of paper. It's just to give the listener or the reader or whatever the impression, okay, there's a lot of it. There's a lot of work here to be done. And that also already ignites the other to think, okay, I feel sorry for you. Should I help maybe? You know, so describing something in a particular way already pressures someone to act or to feel something else. That's what metaphors do in a very quick definition. So a metaphor inspires transformation. So Mr. Schoen in 1709 called that a generative metaphor. And what a metaphor does is it reframes things. It puts things in a different light. It makes you think about things in a different way. So the example that he gives is from the United States and inner city development projects in the United States and policy documents about that. So in the 1950s, after the Second World War, there was a big initiative in the United States to clean up some of the bad neighborhoods in the big cities in the United States. And of course they needed to write all kinds of policy documents for municipal governments to make those kinds of decisions, right? And they used certain kinds of metaphors in there. For instance, they described those neighborhoods as diseased, you know, a lot of crime, a lot of poverty and all that stuff. And they use the word blight. Now, blight is like a blemish or something that's irreparably wrong, right? The implied action there is a blight. For instance, on an apple, you have this brown spot, right? You don't eat that. Now you cut it out. So in that sense, also, if a neighborhood is a blight, a blemish on the face of the city, what do? You destroy it and you put something bright, new, and shiny there. That's the implied action. Now, they did that. And they found out that those new, bright and shiny neighborhoods also very quickly devolved into an unorganized mess. So a decade later, in the 60s, they started thinking about this in a slightly different way. Instead, because they started realizing that, of course, a neighborhood can have problems. But there's also a lot of potential still there in terms of the community, in terms of the people that have lived there for decades, parents, children, grandchildren, whatever, watching each other, taking care of each other. And if you completely destroy a neighborhood, you also lose that. So you don't want to lose that. Instead of removing and destroying, you want to restore. So they started talking about, you know, the natural fabric or the social fabric of a neighborhood being dislocated. Now, in your body, maybe your arm can be dislocated, you know, it's uit de kom in Dutch. What do you do with a dislocated arm? You don't cut it off, no, you put it back in its proper place. So you help it restore itself. Now, that's what metaphors can do, right? So describing things in a particular way already implies certain kinds of action. So, of course, George W. Bush, president before Obama, dealt with 9/11, was a big deal, of course. And based on that, they started talking about Iraq, Iran, North Korea as the axis of evil. Well, when you call something evil, well, evil is not to be reasoned with, right? You can't negotiate, so you need to destroy it. So that was the leverage, describing it that way, was the leverage to also justify the wars that were started in Iraq and also the very, shall we say, cold attitude towards North Korea. And that usage of metaphors is an act of co-creation. So a writer or someone who's talking can describe things in a particular way, but the audience needs to be receptive to that and act accordingly, right? So both parties are involved in the power of the metaphor. So the most important thing is the kinds of stimuli that you give someone, the kinds of ignition stimuli, also implies a particular way of behaving in the receptive system. So an example of this is an example of an Imagineering thesis that I supervised a couple of years ago by Joana Feio from Portugal. And her issue was that she, well, her parents were undertakers, so they had a funeral home in Portugal. And that was a very, very traditional thing. They only had one flavor of funeral, the traditional Catholic funeral with the black robes and the hymns and all the things. But she noticed that, yeah, it didn't really help people come to terms with the fact that their loved one was gone. So the underlying reason of even having a funeral is not to dispose of the body, but for the people who are still alive to come to terms with the fact that this person that they loved is no longer there. And the ritual is a very important step in that process. So in that very conservative context, that she tried to imagineer something else. So just from this example, what would be your ideas? Something with flowers.
Or maybe not.
Or maybe not. Or maybe not, well, not the traditional flowers, right? Anything else?
Can use the remains to plant something new, like to regrow into.
I think there was a concept from Sweden that you can it can be turned into compost and then they plant a tree on you. I think I want that later. Something like that. Or sometimes they also use some of the ashes in and they make a jewel out of it, or a locket or something that you can wear.
Tattoos as well.
Tattoos,
Have them
yeah.
tattooed into your skin.
Oh, right, with the
With ashes.
Yeah, with ashes.
Yeah. Well, what she did was she opened up that process. So she designed a few interventions, a few tools to make that process more palatable, not just when someone is dead, but also before someone dies, with the actual person who is old and will sometimes die, to figure out what they want. To have the family, the old person who might not have long to live, and friends, family, children, etc., to collectively think about, okay, but what do we want this thing to look like? How do we want to do that? So she looked all over the world, because there's many different funeral rituals, and many of them are much more festive and colorful, and also have flowers, right? And she collected all those stories and concepts, also made them into a nice visual form, and also designed an imaginative artifact, so a little booklet with a wish list where people, which could be used, not so much the booklet itself is not really important, but having the booklet ignites the discussion between the family or with the funeral home and everything else, so that people actually start thinking about this, which in that traditional society was also a little bit taboo. Yeah, you don't really think of the death, you don't really think about it. It's something that happens, but we don't want to deal with that. And now we're dealing with that. And we're thinking about, okay, but it's inevitable, but what can we do? And how can we turn this into the most nurturing experience possible? So that's what she did. That's empowerment, helping people to think and talk about something that is difficult, and also to bring that in line with their own values, the kind of person that they are, and the kind of thing that they want to do, and what they think is important. Now, I'm not going to talk about this very much, but the most important thing is really that all the examples that we've had is basically adding a layer of storytelling and experiences and meaning to a practical process. So, Australian motorcycle event, you need to organize the event. If you add this ownership idea to it, this shared co-creative value aspect, then it means something to people, and then people start seeing things in a different way. Also with the funeral aspect, so of course funeral, you take a dead body, you put it in the ground, but it means something. It has emotional impact, and think about that, and use that meaning and those experiences and the ritual as an experience to reframe the way in which we think about these things, and get people to really express what they consider to be closest to themselves, what their values and their important things are. Now there's a whole theory behind this. I have included these slides just to explain some of these more formal steps. Also, I think, maybe I shouldn't say this out loud, but I'm going to anyway. You're dealing with complexity in dynamical systems. What you need is a much older, because complexity thinking is something that's from the late 20th century, early 21st century. You need something that's much older. Plato, 2,500 years, already said it. You have this, you have the head, you have the heart. And sometimes they're not aligned. And sometimes when you get things done, you don't need the head, you don't need that rational process. You need to appeal to people's emotions and feelings and what they consider to be important. And that's, I think, navigating between the two and bringing them in alignment and stimulating those processes, that's what I'm going to do. Right? And complexity, of course, if you want to do like sort of an econometric approach and modeling of these systems, you can do that, and it's very useful, but that's not what you guys do. Because you go into the system and you do stuff, you get things done, and all that formal modeling is not really necessary. Now, all this stuff, if you want to know about it, I have a few copies of a chapter in, I read a book together with a colleague, which is The Philosophy of Leisure. And I've talked about leisure and this sort of power to change communities about it a little bit, right? In this chapter, this all gets explained. And a lot of other stuff, also the Bate and Robert co-creating with patients stuff, it's all in here as well. So if you want it, you can get it. But this is the model that's in the book. The most important thing is that combination of a rational process and an emotional or experience-based process, and bringing those two in alignment. That's what the Imagineer does, and that's where the Imagineer gets her leverage. So I have, and this is there's only one part 10 after this, so we're almost done. What? I have a case study example. So I want your input a little bit. So we have 2, 4, 6, 8, 11 people, 11 students in the room. So maybe 2 groups. So I want those 2 groups, 5 people and 6 people, to do a super quick brainstorm and then a little pitch on how you can stimulate Dutch consumers to buy green or sustainable energy. That's a big deal right now, you know, with the climate transition that we're in. So the government is also very big on that. I think in Brazil this summer we also had a incident of sorts that sort of sparked discussion internationally a little bit.
Yeah, a little bit.
Yes. So it's a big deal these days. Now, using the definition, quote unquote, of Imagineering that we had earlier, we can unpack this a little bit. So we had the co-creation of shared values by designing a meaningful experience as what an Imagineer does. And if you look at the question, how can you stimulate Dutch consumers to buy green or sustainable energy, there's a couple of components in there. So one of them has to do with shared values. You want your audience to have that same idea of it's important to us, personally, collectively, to buy green energy rather than grey energy. So you need to do something with those values, that people value that particular perspective. There's also the co-creation aspect, because we're dealing with a specific group of people with specific properties, you know, specific demographic properties and psychological properties. Dutch people, statistically obviously, are different than Peruvian people or Brazilian people. There's lots of similarities, that's how statistics work, right, overlap, but you know, there are some characteristics that make us a little bit different than the other. Makes things interesting, shall we say. Also, you want to stimulate those Dutch people, so you want to give them something, a stimulus, an ignition of some sort. You want to give them an experience that seduces them to come up with that transition, right? And then how, of course, you need to figure out how. And that's why it was interesting, I think it was you, when we were, the very first example, the Australian motorcycle thing. The very first suggestion that you did from how can we get from it, yeah, you need to figure out what those people think, why they do that. So that's the researcher in you talk. That's very important. And I know that that's not necessarily the favorite aspect for every student, but it is very important to figure this stuff out. Then to figure the stuff out in advance, because you need that foundation, right? You need to figure out what is going on before you can make the right kinds of additions or stimuli. So, that's a very brief brainstorm, like a couple of minutes. And then what kinds of ideas would you have to get this done? So you can sit together a little bit. Now we have 5 and 5, so that's a nice evenly balanced.
Quickly before she comes back.
Quickly.
Elevator pitch.
Elevator pitch is very, very short. So as if you're only like 1 minute in an elevator. So a story that you can tell while you're in the elevator. When you get out, everything is complete.
Owner of the company.
Yes, suppose that you're sharing the elevator and you have only 1 minute until he gets off at his point. And I learned memorandum of understanding. We told each other something.
In a way you knew it, in a way you knew it.
Of course.
Yes.
Yeah, but then you don't make the connection. Yeah, I know the thing, but the abbreviation.
So, writing messages, the message of neighbors' behavior
Look at them co-creating.
address them to say like, okay, so your neighbors are actually using sustainable energy for by saying that neighbors are
We'll put this in here for a while. A possible analysis could be, it doesn't matter that they're Dutch. So, yeah, right across the hall.
Yes.
Kids have certain methods, you have to do this, and this.
Okay, so when Tiago gets back, we'll start the pitches. Pressure cooker.
So how do you do this?
Every person is like 10.
Compared to other countries, you have electric car everywhere, and I saw, oh my god, it's cool. It's everywhere. You can just charge your car.
They're still too expensive for most people.
Yeah. Oh. But you have that station everywhere. Yeah. That's great.
So are you saying playing into the emotions to make a better in a way?
Play into their values, what they're looking at.
So the way we communicate it to the consumer, or the consumer communicates it to other people. No, I'm asking. What do you mean by communicating? The way we communicate to we as a company communicate to the consumer, or they communicate to the consumer?
George's green. Oh, it's me.
He is back, so it's time for the pitches.
Elevator pitch.
That was the timer, basically.
Can I have one?
Sure. Also send it digitally.
It did, but I'm not in your mail list.
I saw some. Well, from somewhere. Okay, time, be boarded. Yes, elevator pitch. But not in an elevator. We're still very busy.
Your neighbor last week, you don't see what I had. And also,
We're drawing something. Stop.
they will freeze their eggs.
One.
Yes.
I'm not sure if I heard everything.
Yeah, I think it's nice to think about.
Right. So, 1 minute.
Yeah, what, less than a minute.
Less than a minute.
So we thought that we looked at why should people actually buy clean green energy, because it's good for the planet. Where you kind of want to clean your karma and kind of, you know, even out your carbon footprint. And we thought by doing that, by playing into the emotions of the customers, to kind of focus on future generations. So the focus should not be on what you're buying, but that you're not buying green energy, you're buying a clean planet. So kind of found solutions, and well, we didn't get to the transformative experience part, but create an experience where you actually emphasize that it's not the energy you buy, it's the future you're contributing to.
So that's a reframe.
Yeah, it's like a shift in, you're not buying power, you're buying sustainability.
All right. Team Pink.
Yes, so imagine you have a great neighbor who just installed a solar panel. And maybe you think it's not something you're planning to do, but actually there's research showing that you are much more likely to do that if your neighbor did it. So we found two perspectives in it. First of all, it's the communication perspective, like you really want to be part of this community. If your neighbor did that, it's kind of likely for me to do that, because we're one community. And the second perspective pointed was a personal one. Because when you know what the green energy will benefit you and your kids, you're also more likely to do something because it speaks to your own personality. So we combined the two issues and we came up with two proposals. So the first one is, we as a solar panel company who just installed solar panels at your neighbor would ask your neighbor to their permission to write a few words on a booklet, which would be delivered to your home as a post, saying something like, yeah, your neighbor just installed the solar panels and it benefited them in this and that way. Why didn't you do that? And the booklet would also be an invitation for a event, a neighbor gathering event where you could exchange on the topic. So I think that's pretty much it.
So also two slightly different approaches. So reframing the discussion, so using different concepts, different metaphors maybe, to talk about this. You don't buy power, but you buy a cleaner planet. And this is more like a tool, an actual artifact that can trigger people thinking and doing things differently.
It's a positive competition.
Yeah. Well, it's also positive competition because they're also complementary ideas. So if you can bring things together, then maybe that could also be a thing. Right? Yes. Now I also have an example because, of course, it has been done. And I found a really fun one, or at least I don't know about you, by Eneco. That's a Dutch energy company, and they organized the Dutch Championship headwind cycling. So there's a storm, and you need to cycle against it, and they had a championship. Do you know the Delta Works? you know, we're living in this delta and they built all these dams and things and whatever, all these engineering works to keep us safe.
Yes, avoiding the sea.
Yeah. So this is a fun event, a tongue-in-cheek event, but it combines so many things in a very clever way. Some of them are, of course it's a marketing thing, right? So buy our wind energy. We have a lot of wind, look, there it is. Why not use it? And we hate the wind because it bothers us if we need to cycle somewhere and there's rain and blah, but you can also turn it around into something positive. It's also an awareness campaign, so ecological awareness, but there's a lot of very clever things that connect to the soul of the Dutch people, to Dutch history. So for instance, there's in terms of storylines, there's a lot of connection points there. So on a personal level, every Dutch person knows what it is like to need to cycle through fall weather with lots of wind and storm and rain and all that stuff. We hate it, but we need to go because we need to go to school. So when I was a youngin', my school was about 12 kilometers away, and between my house and school was 12 kilometers of open grassland. So there was always, on the way there, I had the wind going against me, and during the day it turned around, obviously, so going home, another... Again. So, everybody knows what it's like. It has embodied, very personally felt experience with this, and a negative association. But now you can reframe that and say, okay, okay, we know about this, and we all share that experience. Every Dutch person knows what it's like, but now let's turn it into something positive, because it is our energy source. Yeah, we do have a little bit of oil, and we had gas, but we need to stop mining that. We don't have mountains for hydropower, but we do have wind, and we can use that. Also at a cultural level, of course, it is organized on the Oosterscheldekering, so this part of the Delta works, very open, but also this very impressive engineering feat. So the Instagram pictures are of course beautiful with all the dark skies and the wind and all these people. And of course it's tapping into Dutch pride, because we are very low, that's what the Netherlands means, low countries, below sea level for a big part of the country, but we tamed nature by making those delta works. And now we're using that as the setting for this particular event, so tapping into Dutch cultural awareness. In the advertising campaign, they talked about the Dutch mountain. Now, of course, when you follow cycling a little bit like the Tour de France and the Vuelta in Italy and so, the most exciting part of those cycling competitions, that happens in mountains. But the Netherlands is also super flat. Our Vaalserberg is 321 meters tall. That's the highest point. That's pathetic.
How high is it?
321 meters. So that's nothing. It's just a speed bump. But we feel that we feel as if we're going up a mountain when we have that wind blowing in our hairs. So we can use the Dutch mountain, all that wind, and also use it for a clean energy source. So there's also that pride. We don't have mountains, but we do have this kind of a mountain, metaphorically speaking.
Friction.
Yeah. And so that connects to all kinds of things. So vicarious experience means that you've actually experienced it yourself. You feel it in your bones. When you see someone, you're sitting in a train or in a car, and you see someone battling against the wind on a bike, you almost feel it. Oh yeah, I know what that's like. It's also part of our narrative identity, because we all have those experiences. It's embodied, it's reframing, it's storytelling, it's all the things. And it's also social media savvy, because in advance but also afterwards, all these pictures and the winner, and they all dress up in ridiculous costumes, as Dutch also football supporters tend to do, with all kinds of orange type nonsense. Yeah, they do that. So it's a fun thing, and it reframes a couple of things in a very clever way, using stuff that's already part of Dutch history and the Dutch soul. So in that sense, it's very clever. And that is the kind of foothold that, as an Imagineer, you also might want to try and get. So using potential that's already available there in the system, flipping some of the attitudes around by reframing that narrative, and letting the potential do its thing. That's what you want, that's what you're looking for. So it connects to a lot of different things. Man versus nature, that's sort of a romanticist idea, right? Also, philosophy of technology, so a Dutch person is basically a human plus welded to a bike. You can almost not separate them, they go together. There's lots of leisure stuff in there. It's an event, it's sports, and it's open and co-creative. And come join us because it's fun and all that stuff. And it's self-organization because the event is there, and in itself it's a fun event. But it also triggers all these other things and these reframes and these attitudes and these different ways of looking at things. So that's, I thought it was a fun example.
Is there a video or something?
It should there should be video on YouTube.
Okay, I'll look for
So
that.
I'll get you the slides as well, and you can look for it as well.
Did it work?
They've organized it a couple of times. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think last year.
Ah, come on! I won't do it.
Huh?
It's windy. It's you know.
No, it worked. There were a lot of participants. I think last year they didn't do it because it was wind power 8 or something, and then you get people blowing off into the sea, and they don't want that. But yeah, so it was. Okay, final component. Lilia's not here, so I still have time. Right. So we're working our way towards the 6 commandments of ethical imagineering. Sorry. And the final example that I want to sort of construct this around is voluntourism. Has anyone ever done that? Or know of someone, or know what it is even? I see sort of a hand.
It was programs that needed people for different things. When I saw it was English speakers, and they needed English teachers in different parts of the world to volunteer their time as teachers. So sometimes they would pay for your room and board. You just take your ticket, you pay for the ticket there, and then you would work there for some fixed amount of time, could be short or quite long.
Okay, so that's one form, but another form is that people actually pay an agency to be given the opportunity to go to Africa or some other country and work at an orphanage there for like a week, 2 weeks, something like that. Now, obviously, I think most of the people who do that are, they just got out of high school or got their diploma in university, and they have this gap year and they want to do something. I'm sure they do this with the best intentions, but over time, over the years, there have been quite a few papers and also research that the impact of those initiatives are not necessarily positive for the places where they actually go to. So in that sense, here's the statement. Voluntourists are generally naive, narcissistic, and gullible young people who end up doing more harm than good at their destinations. How would you feel? How do you feel?
Somebody mentioned this before in a workshop, but they didn't elaborate on it much.
All right. Okay.
Okay,
No. Okay, so I have a little explanation, right? Okay, so what is known also in papers and such is that sometimes obviously these people want to do good and it actually works out. But very often they are very disruptive, and not in a good way, not in the Imagineering way, but in a bad way. Because the work that it needs to be done there in those orphanages or building a school or whatever could also be done by locals. But now you have these people from the West paying lots and lots of money, pushing out locals from those jobs. What also happens is, very popular, is that people go to orphanages, but they only go for like a week, 2 weeks, and you start these orphans getting attached, emotionally attached to these people, and then they go away again. What's even more perverse is that it's, in some cases, not always, but in some cases it turns into an actual industry. So those orphanages there actually starts acquisition of kids, take people, take children away from their parents to fill up that orphanage with sad-looking young children. So there's examples also of that's very nasty stuff taking place. So of course these young people from Europe or the United States or whatever, Australia, they go there of course with the intention of doing good. but you end up doing a lot of bad. You don't want that. So they're, in that sense, in those cases, they are naive. They think they're doing something good, but it's not good. Very often, it's also an opportunity to make these kinds of pictures and look how interesting I am and put it on Instagram or Snapchat or whatever. And then you tend to get these kinds of pictures. So these white girls with lots and lots of colored kids. So in the more, shall we say, edgy analyses of these practices, I'm not sure if I really subscribe to that, but it's sort of a white savior complex. Look at me with my all my money, and I'm going to do good, and I'm going to fix the thing over there, the situation. But then in 2 weeks you're gone again. So that's not necessarily a good thing. This girl.
But is it always the case?
No. There are also good agencies, but also a lot of bad ones. And even for the good agencies, you can ask yourself, is this really the right thing to do, or should we stimulate, should we empower the locals to help themselves? And you can do that in lots of different ways. I think that could also be a sort of a frame of looking at the current refugee crisis, right? You could have people come here, or you could help the people over there and make sure that poverty and corruption and all those things are fixed there as well. But it's a very complex situation. But this girl, she also wrote about her experiences. She also came to the conclusion, well, maybe this is not necessarily always the right thing to do. So I think here she's in Africa, but she also went to Costa Rica, and she came to that conclusion that, I'm here, I paid a lot of money, but I'm doing something that could very well have been taken care of also by the locals. So what am I doing? Am I pushing away people from decent jobs? That's not necessarily good. So it's a nuanced thing, right? So sometimes it can definitely be a good thing, but it's also a very corrupt subsector, and there's a lot of abuse and a lot of nasty stuff happening there as well, including actually people who just lose their children and they get taken away and put in these orphanages. That's the extreme end of things. Okay, so what you see here is of course an intervention in an existing system, but an intervention that is disruptive in all the wrong ways. You don't want that. So to avoid that, I came up this morning actually with the 6 commandments of ethical Imagineering. And of course you will get the slides right so you can read that more extensively. But I think a couple of things are very, very important. One of them, of course, truth and honesty. And that also links to your initial statement and also what we just came up talking about a few minutes ago, namely that research is important. The facts do matter. You know, you want to know what is actually going on, what is going on in a system, which parameters, which constraints there are, because that is knowledge that will help you understand what is going on and help you understand much more effective Imagineering interventions. And of course those facts can be of different kinds, right? So I think you've also had lectures, or you will get lectures by Siliani, who's mainly coming from the social constructionist perspective. That's about collectively in a social system creating the facts that are locally applicable, right? So that we agree on, that might not apply elsewhere, but this is what we share. So those could be things, but you also have externally valid facts. You know, natural laws or economic regularities or things are just a particular way in a particular society. And these are all structures that you need to be aware of and you need to align with when you're trying to intervene in a particular system. Whatever you do, it also needs to be feasible and pragmatic. So of course you can have giant dreams, you can have beautiful pie in the sky dreams, but it also needs to be manageable. It needs to be pragmatically possible to do those things. And sometimes, of course, you might want something, but some other people in the system have a different idea. You might not be able to realize what you initially thought, but then, of course, it's up to the people to decide what you want to do. And you also need to be aware of your responsibility. Because you're going to mess up, no, you're going to change something in that system, you're going to do things, you're going to maybe also intervene in structures or habits or a culture that people feel attached to, and you're going to change things. It gives you power. And yeah, with great power comes great responsibility, is what Uncle Ben of Spider-Man said. So that's very important, you need to remember. Has anyone ever read Black Swans or Skin in the Game, or by Anti-Fragility by Taleb, Nestor Nicholas Taleb? Very difficult books, but very important books. I think maybe should also be part of the engineering curriculum. However, one of the books is called Skin in the Game. And basically, skin in the game is a sports metaphor. So when you're actually in a game and you run the risk of being harmed, then you have a different sense of responsibility than when you are on the sidelines saying, okay, you need to do this and you need to go there. You know, if you make a decision, but you are in no way affected or harmed by the outcome, if it is a bad outcome, yeah, then that number 3, that responsibility is also very difficult. So you also always need to figure out, okay, if I change something or if I stimulate a particular kind of change, who is going to pay the price? Who is if something goes wrong, who is going to suffer? Is it you, or is it the other guy that's going to be forced to pick up the slack and is going to clean up after you? You know, so there's this level of involvedness and feeling responsible. Of course, you also need to be fair, because there's a little bit of a danger there. I hope you're aware of that. But a lot of work that Imagineers do have to do with ideology, with the idea of this is better or that is the goal that we want to strive for. And these things can be very subjective, very personal, but also very powerful. And these are also things that people might differ in opinion about. So of course you need to be aware of whether or you're trying to push through your own agenda, or whether you're actually doing someone else benefits, whether you're doing actually good for someone else. But because in the end it's about the company or the system or the community or whatever it is that you're doing your Imagineering work for, that needs to be improved. It's not about you, it's about them. So it's also not about your agenda, not about your ideals or your values, it's about their values. Now, in the Imagineering program, there's 3 different roles that you can take, and one of them is that you're actually an agent of change, that you're actually in there doing stuff, being part of the system. So that's where that danger is probably created. So you think, okay, this is my ideal, it needs to be like this, and then we're going to do that. Don't do that, because then you become a little bit fascistic and you don't want that. And then quality care, of course, goes along with that responsibility. So pay attention to what's happening when you start messing stuff up and make sure that things are okay. So it's not just about good intentions, it's also about really steering towards something that is beneficial to the system itself. And part of that is also taking care, also afterwards, that everything is okay. So I think impact studies, as a research approach, should also be an important aspect of Imagineering. It's not just that you go in there, you change stuff, and okay, now you go take care of yourself, but afterwards you also figure out, okay, what happened? How can we learn from this? How can we maybe make things better a little bit? So these are things, I think, my suggestion anyway, that you should keep in mind when you start messing with people's minds as an Imagineer. That was it. And Lilia is still not here. Any questions? Go ahead. Coffee break, bathroom break, other kinds of break? Just a break.
Is it true that you do not have LinkedIn by any chance?
It's not true that I don't have LinkedIn, because it is true that I do have LinkedIn.
Okay. I was wondering about your background.
My background? My background is in philosophy. So I got my master's and my PhD in philosophy of psychology, and philosophy of science. Also ethics, social innovation a little bit, and lots of other things. So I'm now the coordinator of the academic program here at Leisure Studies. So I'm sort of a middle management type person, and also research. I'm also writing. I also write books. So this is a chapter from that book. And a new one is coming up next year. So that's it. So also, yeah, health, well-being, those kinds of processes have also special interest. It's also connected to ethics, right? Ethics is about sort of a normative structure. Okay, that's not good and that's maybe better. How can we know that? But also, how can we get there? And then you are very quickly also get into well-being, quality of life, those kinds of processes. And that's very closely aligned to Imagineering because, yeah, why do we intervene in those processes? What do we hope to achieve? We want to make things better. Whatever better means, we need to figure that out, but that's what we have to do.
And how did you come up with the 6 commandments? Are they, did they arise from
They just came out.
experience? Yeah.
No, of course, there's lots of work that I've done while writing the book and researching leisure and Imagineering and interacting also with students over the years, getting stuff back from them. So one of the examples was from a student, you know, the funeral home example.
Yeah.
And just figuring out, okay, what kinds of guidelines could you come up with? And these were them. Not necessarily saying that that's complete or even correct, but it's just a suggestion.
Very nice.
All right. Okay. Well, I would say normally throughout the year come visit me over there, but that's not true because tomorrow is the last day that we're here. But yeah, I do have a LinkedIn page. You can always link up.
I will find it if I have that weekend.
I found it.
Good.
Well, there's more than one Marco.
Yeah, but also at Buur.
Yeah, there's 2.
Yes. Okay.
But my email address is leven3.m.
Oh.
So, no, the other one is at the tourism.